I want to welcome all our attendees to our San Clemente Downtown Business Association virtual member meeting. I am Chris Aiken. I'm the chair of the DBA, and I am very pleased to have with us today Jonathan Lightfoot. Jonathan Lightfoot is the Economic Development Officer for the City of San Clemente. He has been taking lead as relates to the concept of the Promenade on Del Mar, the street closure concept that's being developed in San Clemente. And without further ado, what I like to do is I'll turn over to Jonathan. So format-wise, what we're going to do is Jonathan's going to go through a PowerPoint and kind of go over the bullet points of the Promenade. And then we are going to open it up for questions at the end. If you guys, anyone that wants to ask a question, if you could please send your questions through chat, I will be taking note of them. And we did dedicate a time at the end to make sure that your questions are answered. So please feel free to send those through chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Lightfoot. Jonathan.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. As Chris mentioned, I'm in a new position at the City Economic Development Officer, and I'm going to be coordinating with the Chamber and the DBA and North Beach Community Association on a variety of efforts, and the city's goal is just to now have a full-time position that can be a contact for the business community. And as we have different things that come up, such as this effort to look at closing Del Mar and allowing other businesses to have expanded operations areas as we kind of reopen from the COVID closures. I'm going to be just your resource for that. So if you have questions in any regard, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be on the PowerPoint. So what we're going to do first is jump into this PowerPoint. So if we can get that going, and as Chris mentioned, we'll have a period of time at the end to answer initial questions, and anything we don't get to right away, Chris will forward to me, or feel free to contact me directly, and I'll respond to those within the next day or so. So Chris, if we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. And this slide will just give a visualization of what we are looking at. There's some other cities in Orange County that are already making efforts in this direction. So you may have heard about Rancho Santa Margarita and Dana Point allowing for individual businesses to use parking lot spaces or areas. And then some cities are doing, a more focused effort where there's some level of like a street closure. And so Laguna Beach is one of those cities that's doing that. And here in a minute, we'll have a visual of what that looks like. Aliso Viejo has, it's not a street closure, it's actually within their larger theater complex that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where they have a central area that has a few restaurants on both sides, and they blocked access to that area. And so what while Chris is getting that pesky PowerPoint figured out, I'll talk through generally what that could look like with Del Mar. So the idea is to somewhat replicate what we've had for special events in the past, from the car show and Fiesta, et cetera, where there's a closure at the primary access points to Del Mar, and allow the different businesses to expand their areas of operation. While we are reopening, there is, great, okay, I'm gonna cut off where I was going and rewind back to the visualization idea. So this is some graphics that were put together by the consultant that Laguna Beach hired to do their closure. And what you can see on the left is the typical Forest Avenue, not too different from what we have on Avenida Del Mar, the angled in parking and shop fronts. And then on the right, you'll see, the temporary closure. And one of the pieces that we'll come to later is you see there's kind of a large central aisle that's still open, and we would have the same layout to allow for required emergency access, et cetera. We'll get to that point more later, but this helps to give a visual of the concept of what we're looking at doing. So we can move to the next slide, Chris. Before we dive into any details on our potential closure, I just wanted to retouch on kind of how we got to this point of considering doing this closure and the coronavirus context that we're in. If we can go to the next slide, Chris, you'll see here the state's resilience roadmap. The state still identifies that we're in stage 2, but as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the governor's reopening has kind of become a more flexible thing over time. And so Orange County, along with most counties, really just the Bay Area, is still in the stage 2. Most of us are now in the stage 3 for higher risk workplaces. And back at stage 2, though, is when we had the reopening allowance for, or the second half of stage 2 for dining, like in-person dining, no longer restricted to just carry out. And there's specific guidelines that the state publishes, if we can go to the next page, Chris, that talk about that. So for restaurants and retail here, these are just my really quick, points on a few of those things. You can catch the entire guidance at that link above. But for restaurants and retail, there's kind of an expectation that you're screening employees before they come into work, and that they would be wearing masks and be taking all of the necessary health precautions for the visiting public. For restaurants, there's an expectation that you keep tables a minimum of 6 feet apart. And of course, regular cleaning for both of those industries, and a closure of any places that are typical gathering spaces. So like break rooms, or for restaurants, if you have like a host area where people typically sit closely together waiting for a table to open, those are not supposed to be operational right now. And for both of these, there's a reopening checklist, and that's one thing. Feel free to reach out to me. The state did stipulate that every business that reopens should be posting a reopening checklist in their window. It's not something that the state is reviewing. The county's not reviewing that. I'm not reviewing that from the city. It's a requirement, but it's an unenforced requirement. The goal of that is just to show to your customers that you've gone through this list of employee training and cleanup precautions, etc. So it's a self-certification, and that's something, again, if you want that resource, I can send a template your way. Anyways, we've had these different guidances for reopening, and many of you know that it's going to be difficult for restaurants, for example, to lose half of their capacity and still be successful in their operations. So the city council, if we can move on to the next slide. Give us just 1 second to get that changed over. The city council reviewed an item at their prior meeting to approve essentially a stay on some municipal code requirements, and a couple of those are listed here. So I think some of you had to have banner signs removed at some point, and that's not going to be something that the city is enforcing anymore. So typically you have to have a permit, and it's time limited. And council gave us kind of the relief to not enforce that as part of our ongoing emergency order, et cetera. And another piece of that was to allow for these expanded outdoor areas. So some private businesses will be doing areas directly connected to their business. So for instance, Lost Winds Brewery in the business park has a roll-up garage door, and they just put some temporary barriers around that area in the evening hours when they are operating. Del Mar is a little bit more tricky, and that's part of why we're looking at doing this as a collaborative effort, because we do have the need to separate people from traffic and additional safety concerns in this context. Our timeline overall is through September 30th is kind of this flexible window that we have that potentially could be expanded depending on how things move along. If we go to the next slide, Chris. So that brings us back to where we are today, looking at organizing a closure that allows for this expanded outdoor operation on Del Mar. And this example comes from Laguna Beach, as I mentioned. They're on a similar time frame where they are going to have this closure But for them, they're doing like a full closure through Labor Day. So that parking is completely gone all the way from today until early September. That's going to be set up. It's a more formal closure that they're doing. They have a very large budget for this closure. It's something that they'd kind of anticipated trying out anyways. So they're putting a good amount of money into this closure. We're not going to have the same like constructed level of closure as this, but if we can go to the next slide, this will show more of an example of what we would be looking at. This is Aliso Viejo. They just set this up a couple of days ago. Those white barriers in the foreground are called K-rails, and that's for vehicle separation and safety. In this case, one of the restaurants also has kind of a food truck setup, so they put that on one end. And then on the right side of the screen, you can see there's a few small pop-up tents, and the restaurant was pulling out their own tables. The restaurants are responsible for setting up, tearing down, and cleaning up their own spaces. And that's going to be more of the model that we have here for Del Mar, where the city is going to coordinate some high-level pieces such as the closure, but the restaurants and retailers will have more responsibility for kind of cleaning up and setting up their own spaces. So we can go to the next slide, Chris. So key ideas, again, is to allow for more breathing room for these restaurants. While there's obviously a lot of different opinions on the closure and the reopening, the goal for us and for the DBA is that your customers that come feel that you've thought this through, that you're making an effort to provide a safe environment. And while there's definitely some vocal people in San Clemente and everywhere, that think this is unnecessary, there's a lot of people who are not going to be patronizing these businesses if they don't think that these things have been thought through. So we really want to make sure that we're able to capture kind of that iceberg under the water level of people that we want them to feel comfortable to come back out and patronize the businesses. And so allowing this extra space and an operation that's outdoors, we think can accomplish that. With this closure, we're looking at sidewalks staying clear. We don't have large enough sidewalks, unfortunately, on Del Mar to do a lot of setup there. So those would be kept clear. And the circulation idea would be walk up the central area of the street, walk down the sidewalks. Again, just to try to minimize congregating and people that are bumping into each other. We also are looking at establishing consistent hours, and that's something that we'll maybe get to some feedback after the presentation. Looking at setting up at 9 a.m., tearing down at 9 p.m. And again, to make things simple for the public and to maximize the opportunity for these closure days. I think it would be good to consider potentially expanding your business hours to align with this time frame as possible. The lower Del Mar option is something that's still being figured out, but we are looking at incorporating the farmers market, which already operates on Sundays, and the art fair as well. So that's one piece that we're going to have to figure out where the staging for these different elements is occurring. And there'll be some ongoing discussions about that. If we could move to the next slide. I mentioned the circulation earlier. So this is, it accomplishes two things. So the first, of course, is so we don't have people bumping into each other, as I mentioned. And the other piece is that we have to keep 20 feet clear for Orange County Fire in case there is any kind of an emergency. They'll need to be able to bring a truck down the center area. So the tables, any tables that are set up are largely going to be in the parking stall area and those bulb outs that we have on Del Mar. So that'll be kind of your visualization of where things will be set up, and the central aisle will be for pedestrian access and then emergency access, hopefully not needed, but to maintain that required separation. If we go to the next one. So our next steps, one is to kind of empower an executive team. We definitely want communal input, but things like this are really hard to pull off if we wait for consensus on every piece. So we want to get high level response from the group on what things are important and what hours work for people, things of that nature. But then the details, hopefully we'll leave to a group that can kind of spend some extra time making sure that that gets ready. So a part of that would be to prepare a closure map and timetable And that closure map is something that I would be working with Orange County Fire and Orange County Sheriffs to submit to them and get any feedback to make sure that we can get permitting or staffing as needed from those agencies. With our overall closure, there's an application that the city made available for each individual business to have their operations expand into either private or public areas. The DBA is actually going to submit the umbrella application. It's super short application, but we'll have any businesses that want to operate in the street will need to sign the acknowledgement form, touches on pieces like required cleanup after the event, etc. So if you are going to be participating, that's something that I'll be relaying to you. Also, if you're a restaurant, you still cannot serve alcohol out in the public street area unless what I'm recommending is that you get apply for ABC's COVID permit. There's a permit that is, I believe it's $100, and their turnaround time is about 48 hours. So it's a pretty quick process right now to get their COVID-19 temporary catering permit. And there's a lot more flexibility than typically with ABC in obtaining these. So that's something that you can get once and then can cover for the duration of the events that we have. We also are going to need to plan for any rental needs. I know that the city has some pieces that we can supply, umbrellas, for instance, but we'll want to discuss what needs the business community has generally. We have some tables, but those tables are more of the typical, like Costco long rectangular plastic tables. So finally, the intention is to close on a Sunday and then assess and then repeat. So the repeat portion could be, singular days spaced out. It could be longer periods of time potentially, but we do want to do kind of our trial run, learn from best practices, and then schedule out kind of the remainder of the summer for opportunities there. Okay, Chris, if we can finish up. So this is just a very preliminary map I threw together that indicates Del Mar. Those red kind of warning signs are the locations of potential closures, and those may shift a little bit. You can see on the far bottom left, you have a yellowish color that I've labeled as kind of the Seville area of Del Mar. The green is the lower Del Mar, the separation being the library location, where obviously you have a drive aisle access through to Cabrillo. And then the blue area is upper Del Mar, and a couple purple sections that I've called like the elbows. That's Ola Vista and the alleyways. So those are the different areas that we'd be looking at and figuring out how we're going to program those different spaces. And of course, those closure pieces are going to be things that get discussion with OCFA and OCSD. So that's just a general map, and we may pop back to this during discussion. So we can move on, Chris. So some of the pieces, that we may want to feel free to, within the chat icon below or the Q&A, either ask questions or also provide commentary. Identify yourself if you could, if you have a comment on, for instance, frequency. How often would you like to see this event occur? So identify yourself as a restaurant or retail or what business you are, and what type of frequency you'd be interested in, as well as if you have any rental needs for your business. And then I'd also like to just get some general feedback on whether that 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Standardized time frame works for everyone. And then finally, the general thought for spacing is that we're going to keep businesses to the areas directly in front of their store frontage, so that we, again, have clarity of where you're setting up and where you're tearing down and where you're cleaning, so that everyone can kind of pull their own weight in that piece. So if you could comment on a couple of those things, but also now I'll be open to taking some questions, and I think Chris may be able to chime in on some as well.
Okay. All right, Jonathan, let me pull up the chat box. Can you hear me okay, Jonathan?
I can, yes.
Okay, so the first question that has come before is, it's One question is, can businesses like mine, a financial advisor, have a table on Del Mar on Sundays? I guess the opportunity for the service industry to also potentially be incorporated in Del Mar, I think, is the heart of that question. Any thoughts about that, Jonathan?
Yeah, yeah, I'm not opposed to that. The focal area was restaurants and retail, but especially with Del Mar being, closed generally, I don't have an issue with that. There would probably have to be like a longer policy discussion outside of the Del Mar area. If we had started getting a lot of requests for service industry tables, but typically those scenarios would be like, sidewalks, et cetera. In this instance, with the Del Mar closure, I'll confirm through Chris and the group that that's not an issue, but I don't expect that to be an issue to have tables for the service.
Perfect. The next question is similar. Is from a law office, and kind of a similar question about a service industry participation.
Yeah, so I would say the one thing just to expect is we'll still have you sign the acknowledgement. Any business that wants to operate outdoors on those days, just that you sign the acknowledgement form. So we'll make that available to everyone.
Okay. Next question, Jonathan, is you mentioned permits for restaurants. Do non-restaurants need to obtain a permit to participate?
Yeah, so in this case of the Del Mar closure, we're going to have one umbrella permit that covers the closure. And so, no, there won't need to be any individual applications coming in from the Del Mar businesses. What we're going to do, again, is have the DBA submit the overall permit, and then we'll have each business, again, sign those acknowledgement forms that you'll take care of the cleanup, et cetera, for your respective areas.
Okay. The next is a comment. I guess a comment in support of the 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. timeframe. That's a comment. The next one is a question. It's just basically parking question mark. Probably just inquiring as far as like your thoughts on parking.
Yeah, so obviously parking is something that, we have a good amount of parking on Del Mar. And the concept with the closure does remove a portion of that parking. One of the pieces that is that there's still some discussion on is the extent of the closure on Del Mar. There are some different alternatives of whether we close all the way from El Camino Real down to Seville, or whether we close off the lower portion higher up near the library where there's still a cut through access. That's one piece that we're still going to do some finalized, discussions over, whether some of that additional parking can remain open. The library parking and obviously all of the, rear lots will be open. And the goal again for this is to, have a 1 day trial to feel that out. So that's one of the reasons why we're not doing a permanent closure now and moving on, so that we can review and assess what that looks like on the parking side. Obviously, the events that we have on Del Mar bring a significantly higher number of people, where we're expecting thousands of people. And granted, we do have typically like trolley or some other means for people to come. But I've attended those events, and I regularly, and I think most local San Clementians know that when these types of events are happening, you find parking on Cabrillo or on Granada, and then walk in. So there's obviously parking resources around the area. And the goal, again, is to not have thousands of people. The goal is to allow all these businesses to operate at their typical capacity. So that's those are my thoughts there, and we'll adapt after the first event as we see fit based off of the parking.
Okay, the next question's on parking as well, and then it goes to now. There's a question. There's a comment. One says, "How soon can we start?" And then right under it says, "Hopefully the SC trolley can assist the parking issue." Right? Is it? I'm not sure if can you comment on the trolley, or is that something to comment on at this point?
Yeah. As of now, the trolley is not running. So I'll be having a discussion the first part of this week with our Director of Public Works, who will be kind of instrumental in this in a couple of ways. One, the street closures are things that I'll be coordinating with him. And then two, the trolley piece, I can check in with him on the status. The last I had heard is the city was considering resuming operations, but the soonest potential resumption of that would be July. And that is not a guarantee by any means. It's also not something that's purely a city effort. We get county funding, and again, all of these, there's a lot of elements right now at play, right, where we don't have sole discretion always in what opens or at what time, because other agencies may also take a more cautious stance than we would. But right now the trolley is not open, and it probably would not be available for the first closure, potentially the later closures, depending on how things progress.
Okay, Jonathan, the next question is, in essence, it's at some key restaurants on Lower Del Mar. Would they be able to move out to the street? And the follow-up is, how will you handle residents where their parking access is on Upper Del Mar? So I guess it's a two-part. It's the restaurants on the lower and some of the residents on the upper, kind of handling that.
Yeah. So my thought is that the Lower Del Mar would still be closed. The one area that is to be determined still is by the library. So north of the library, certainly the intent is to have those areas closed so that people can be moving their business elements out into the street. The lower end Seville piece, just again to help frame that idea, is really the library and lower, and that's part of why the closure is a little more complicated down there, is the amount of residences that have access really only from Del Mar. A little further up, there's some more units, but they can access parking from the Granada side. As for Upper Del Mar, that's a piece that we are going to have to coordinate with those residents. Again, we're going to have to maintain an emergency access area for vehicles to come through. So there'll be one location where there's not a permanent barrier, where we will likely use like vehicles. So it's not that there could be no access, but we would have to coordinate to make sure that that it's a very, very limited and specific access. If there are residents that can only access their parking from Del Mar, then we would coordinate that through the one movable barrier location.
Okay, the next question is on bike racks. Will bike racks be available to promote that activity?
Yes. So that is something that falls under our rental needs. Unfortunately, I did check in with our Parks and Rec, and we don't have like a stock of loose bike racks, but that is something that we do want to include with like the rental supplies that we'd be using for that day. I'm sure all of you have experienced, as I have, that there's a lot more people out and about on foot and on bike. So I think that that's one piece to that whole puzzle, is I think we'll have a good number of people that will arrive that day from the neighborhoods on foot or on bike. And so we want to make sure that we have facilities like that where people can secure their bikes when they come to the area.
Okay. Well, if there's that's all the questions I have right now. Does anyone have any other questions? Please submit them. Also, what I can do is share your email too, Jonathan, unless you have any other comments. Those are the questions I have so far.
Okay.
Let's see. Anyone else have any other questions? Okay, here. What I'll do.
So one last piece, so while you're working on something I'll address is, what's our timeline look like? Our timeline is really contingent on our next step is producing that closure map. So finalizing what pieces are closed and then submitting that to OCFA. So really, as soon as we get our Orange County fire go-ahead, then that's when we'll select that first Sunday. And as soon as we get that closure go-ahead, the idea is to move very quickly. You know, I think we'll need kind of a minimum of a 1-week general notice for everyone to be ready for that. But I'm hoping that, you know, I've already been in communication with OCFA, so they know that we'll be sending something their way. And then we'll alert everyone as soon as we have that approval back and are ready to schedule that first day.
Okay, Jonathan, I think there's a couple questions, but I threw up this slide here because if you have any further questions or comments for Jonathan directly, please take down his email here. It can be reached through the City of San Clemente, but let me, it's a little easier to, okay. Jonathan, there is, let's see, one more question. Okay, two more. One's a comment. Love the Promenade idea. Thank you for your work towards this. The second one is, how and when should we go to the City Hall to obtain the acknowledgement to sign, or can be obtained online?
Yeah, that's something that I'll just email to everyone that's interested in participating. So feel free to either proactively reach out to me. I'll also make that acknowledgement form available to Chris. So either of those routes will work. In this case, City Hall is actually still closed at this point, or at least to the public. I'm obviously in City Hall, so we're still working, but you can't walk into the doors right now. So what you would do is just get that by email, fill out the form, and scan it back to me. And that's all that would be needed. So you don't have to come in to the office to do that.
Yeah, and Jonathan, we'll work, you know, after I get it from you, we'll work at the Downtown Business Association, get it on our website and certainly send it out to all our members, participants as well.
Great.
Okay. Does anyone else have any? There's another minute or two for any questions that you would have, or any other comments that you'd like to address now. I mean, going forward, we are going to send out the information through, you know, the DBA upon receipt, and certainly Jonathan's going to make himself available going forward for additional questions.
Yeah. And Chris, maybe one last piece too. It's kind of tough to do on a video call like this, but potentially we could have the different business owners reach out to you, or if you have a general DBA email with their comments. So if we could get everyone to maybe shoot a quick note to Chris about my interest would be whether you're excited about this trial closure, the first one, or if you have concerns. 2 would be what your interest would be in the regularity of something like this moving forward. So I see it looks like Chris put the general info@scdba.org email address there. So if you could shoot your thoughts on how often you'd like to see something like this happen, you know, I think that's something that we'd like to take into account. Again, we're going to do the single trial event first, and then make those determinations. But it would be good to know, you know, in some cases, this is going to be a great opportunity for businesses, but also I recognize that some of you may have concerns about that. So we want to hear from all of you about that as we, you know, start to look at mapping out the rest of the summer.
Yeah, and I put the general email for the San Clemente Downtown Business Association. You have Jonathan's, you have mine. We certainly welcome all your comments. We would love your comments on your thoughts about the closure trial, you know, and going through the process. And certainly, we, you know, at the DBA, we want to help out the businesses. Certainly mindful of there's been a lot of thought process also in the health and safety issues as well. So that's all being developed. We would like your comments, and so please feel free to email the Downtown Business Association, Jonathan. If you have any people that you know that are interested in giving their comments, we encourage them. We want to answer your questions. So I'll just kind of make that general comment.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that kind of wraps it up for me today, Chris, but I'm looking forward to meeting all of the DBA members in person soon. So hopefully once we move in that direction, I'll be able to coordinate with all of you in person. Looking forward to that, and excited to try something out like this and see where it goes. I think it's a good effort to give the local businesses a chance to kind of make their neighborhood, their area, their own. So we'll see how this works, and it's always good to do practices like this, and then as we're doing in this case, step back and evaluate and see, like, how did that work for business? How did that affect the customer's experience of the area? So we'll definitely have a follow-up after that first event, and discuss and work through how everything turns out. But excited to be working with you all soon. So thank you for having me today.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for everyone attending. We appreciate it, and feel free to contact us. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.